Well, good morning, good afternoon, about 2 o'clock now. I hope you can hear me well. Welcome back from last week. The program today is going to be, I am going to post some questions that have been posed to me by different people in different talks. And I'm going to give a short but hopefully comprehensive answer to the question that I posed, that has been posed to me. And then I will check on the chat line after that and try and pick a couple of your questions, hopefully related to that question, try and answer them live, and then go on to the next topic. If I don't answer your question live because there's too many or I need to do a little bit of work, I will endeavor to do so after the program is over, so you can just post them on the chat line. So that's what we're going to do. Thank you very much for joining us. So the first topic, the first question is, if God created the universe, why don't we see proof of it? Or do we? This was posed by a young adult, and I guess it comes from the fact that when we look at public television or go to museums, natural history museums and so on, it's pretty clear that science has a fairly well-developed natural explanation about how the universe and life came about, and it seems to present it as, and that's what it is. We'll see in a minute that it does have a very good explanation, but it also has a few places where it has no explanation at all. In fact, it's a huge mystery. So let's see what Genesis say we should expect when we study the universe through the scientific method, and that will help us arrive at an answer, I think. So to understand Genesis, we have to look at two things. First of all, we have to check what name of God is being used in the narration. We're created in the image of God, and we also have names, and our names give us quite a bit of an indication of what's going on. So I have my essential name, Daniel. That doesn't tell you much information, but if somebody introduces me as engineer or father or husband, that will give you quite a bit of information, because I'll tell you what mode I'm manifesting at that point. The same is true with Hashem, obviously an infinite being. And when he narrates a particular part of the Torah in a particular name, it means that that divine attribute related to that name is coming down at that time. And that is a big hint about what's going on. It turns out that the name that God uses in the first chapter of Genesis is not his essential name, but a very specific name, which Rambam translates as God acting as if he was acting through nature. So although God created the natural laws right at the beginning, he has the choice to either live within those laws or act above nature, what we call a miracle. The Torah is telling us, because God uses a particular name to narrate Genesis, that everything in Genesis, he was appearing to act through nature. That's the first thing we need to understand. The second thing we need to understand is that when you look at the actual Hebrew words in the Genesis account, when it says, let there be light, let the waters swarm, and so on, those words indicate what we would call in English making something, meaning that I take something that already exists and I make something else, like cooking. I take a bunch of ingredients and I make a new thing, but the new thing is made from existing ingredients. So if in Genesis, God is taking existing things and making new things, and is doing so appearing to act through the laws of nature, well, that is the definition of the scientific method. That means that because he did it this way, when we study the universe through the scientific method, we're going to understand it, because God was acting through what we would call a natural process. So it's no wonder that science has been very successful at developing some theories about how things came about. However, there's 3 times in Genesis, out of the 10 creation sayings, there's 3 creation sayings where God doesn't start from something that already exists. He starts from nothing. The Hebrew word is the word bara, meaning out of nothing, God created. So if we study those parts of Genesis, there will be no scientific explanation, because science doesn't deal with nothing. It always takes something to something else. The ball falls. How does it fall? According to the law of gravity. We don't know exactly what that law really means. We can work with it mathematically, but we don't understand it. But we can predict things. So in these parts where it starts from nothing, we won't know. So let me just quickly review those, and they will immediately show you God's hand in creation. The first bara, out of nothing creation, is Bereshit bara, right at the beginning. In the beginning, God created. And our sources explain that what God created was time and space and the forces of nature and the particles, the ingredients from which everything would be fashioned. If you look at the bestseller Brian Greene book on cosmology, he'll tell you that the Big Bang Theory is extremely successful in explaining how the universe developed, but it says nothing about time zero. In fact, science has no idea where time and space and particles came from at this point. They have lots of theories, but none of them are accepted. The next bara event is not first life. Interestingly enough, first life is making from pre-existing things, but it's the first bara is the creation of the sea animals, the big complex things, not a few cells, which was the first life, but big complex things. I mean big, like a foot big. And that is a bara event. And in science, that is known as the Cambrian Explosion. It's a period of time in the fossil record where most complex creatures appeared, and the body plans, the designs, all appeared, the designs that are used today in everything that we see, and not well explained in science. And the final bara is us humans, not our bodies, as we'll see in another question, but our souls. And I won't go too much into that because there's another question on it, which give us very unique powers. So in short, what Genesis is telling us is that the way in which God brought about the universe, the way in which He created the universe, is amenable to be studied and understood by science in most instances except three: the very beginning of the universe, the beginning of complex life, and humans. And in those three, science will not be able to find a good answer. And therefore, that's what it's predicting, and that's exactly what we're finding. So if you look in those places, you will see God in creation. And I will stop at this point before going on to the next question, see if there's any questions that you have specifically. Thank you all for saying good morning and good afternoon, and you can hear well. I appreciate the feedback in this COVID age of isolation. If you have a question specifically on this topic or something wasn't clear, I'll wait a minute. And if there isn't one, I'll go on to the next topic. I think last time it took a while for you to warm up and send me hard questions, which is good. The next topic is a little lighter than the first topic. Okay, I'm not seeing, I hope I'm looking in the right place, but I'm not seeing any questions. I'll keep going. The next question actually is quite interesting. It came clearly from a young kid. I didn't record the ages of people when they asked me the questions. I just recorded the questions. And at first I thought, well, this is kind of a strange question, but it turns out to be a very good question. Here's the question. In Genesis, when it says it was evening and it was morning, does it imply that God has to sleep between creations? And it turns out to be a very good question, because when you look in the sources, it turns out, as we will see, that God doesn't actually create at night. He primarily creates during the day. He does some creating at night, but most of the time, He creates during the day. So let's have a look at that. So in Genesis, you recall the creation is done in 6 days. And the days are 24-hour days. There are Jewish days that start in the evening, normally 6 o'clock. Of course, it varies with latitude and seasons, but normally 6 o'clock p.m. and ends the next sunset at 6 p.m. So we always have night first. That's why our holidays start at night, and then day. 12 hours of night, 12 hours of day nominally. And we learn from the details of day 6, at least, that the activities going on during the day. It says that God made the animals. Okay, well, it's not clear that's day or night, but then it says it made Adam, and Adam named the animals. Well, presumably Adam was naming the animals during the day, and later on, Eve was eating from the tree during the day, and so on. Now, we can see that from the Genesis text, but if you go to the Talmud, it gives us an hour-by-hour detail of what happens on day 6. It tells us what happened every hour on day 6. And the last thing that happened is that Adam and Eve were expelled from the garden for sinning, and that is clear that that is just minutes before Shabbos. So it's completely clear from the text, and all our commentaries agree that the 12 hours that God worked on day 6 were the 12 daylight hours. He didn't start working at 6 p.m. on Thursday night. He started working at 6 a.m. on Friday morning, and Adam was expelled just before Shabbos on Friday afternoon. And there are other sources in the Talmud that indicate that God primarily works during the day. So, the kid's question is actually very deep. What's going on? And the concept here is that each creation day is accompanied with an emanation from God. So in the first day, God emanated hesed, or kindness. And of course, we see that the main creation of the first day is light. In the second day, God emanated gevura, or separation, or judgment, and he spent the time separating the waters. And these 6 emanations what was required to create the world. And the night period is a period where there's kind of a switch from one emanation to the other emanation. Now, what is really going on here? Let's look at what happens when we sleep, because we're made in the image of God. So we can look at that. So when we sleep, we lose control of our soul. We're no longer conscious. We're no longer creating. We're no longer running around, unless we're sleepwalkers. We're no longer running around doing things. We're just letting the body do its thing, and the body continues to breathe. The body continues to digest. The body continues to work, but nothing new happens because we're not exercising our willpower. And the same is a concept for Hashem. When Hashem is not exercising his will to create and he's letting things develop naturally, he is as if he was asleep because he's not pushing his will. So in the creation narrative, what's happening is during the daylight hours, God is exercising his will. He's making things happen. Let there be this, let there be that. But in the night, God is letting things develop naturally until he picks up his will again the next morning, as we do when we wake up, and he exercises his will. So he's clearly not asleep, but he's also not working 6 by 24. He's working 6 by 12 and letting things evolve naturally overnight, and then bringing in some new energy the next day. So that's the answer to the meaning of evening and morning in the creation story. We see a element of this. You'll recall from Purim not too long ago, when we could still almost get together. We were just on the edge. It says there, the king could not sleep anymore. And at that point, he looked in the book, and the whole story changed, and the Jews were eventually saved. And of course, the king there means the physical king, but the Kabbalah explains that we can read the whole story as if it was God. So basically, God had let natural events go forward because we weren't paying attention. And at that point, he switched his mind, he became engaged, and he created the miracle, or the process which created the miracle of Purim. Same concept, whether it's engaged or not. Okay, thank you very much. That's that topic. If you have any questions or clarifications on that one, I'll look at the chat line for a minute. If not, I will go on to one I'm sure will get people excited in a minute. If you think of questions later, just put them on, and I will come back to them. So the next topic I wanted to discuss, a little sticky topic, but has to be faced, and the Torah actually has a very good answer for it. And the question is, what does the Torah say about our relationship to apes? Did we evolve from apes? So let me start with the science first, so we're all clear on what science is saying. because that's obviously what's motivating the question. Science says that there's enough similarities, both physical and genetic. Now that we have DNA, we can sequence our genes and the apes' genes and so on. There's enough similarities between us and living primates, particularly apes today, to postulate that at some point we descended from a common ancestor and over time changed, as evolution explains, into what we are today. Now scientists arrive at this conclusion by studying living primates, by studying ourselves, of course, and also by studying a number of creatures in the fossil record that they call in the human lineage. Now, one has to understand that science has a definition of human that is completely different than the Torah definition of human. In the science definition of human, a human is anything that looks more like us than an ape. So if they find remains in the fossil record of something that looks a little more like us than an ape, they say, well, that was in the human lineage. And that's how science defines it. We'll talk in a minute about Torah defines human, but it's completely different. So through this process of looking at all this, science postulates that through a period of gradual changes, apes and us descended from the same earlier being, which has not been identified. Now, what does the Torah have to say about all this? It's quite different. So clearly in the Torah, we all know that God created everything separately. He created the inanimate world, the vegetable world, the animal world, and the humans. The animal world, each kind was created separately. And of course, we're a special creation. As we spoke a little earlier, we're one of the baras with a divine soul. So there's no concept whatsoever of evolution between species in the Torah. However, and the Rebbe himself points this out in one of his letters, once a particular kind is created, that kind can adapt to its environment. And we have direct quotes in the Talmud of how humans have adapted to the environment and changed their skin color and their hair and their size and their feet size and so on. But that's all within the same human kind on it. So the interesting thing, however, is that in the Kabbalah, it goes into quite a bit of explanation about what the creative process was and what the order. So first came the inanimate world, the rocks, then came the vegetable world, then came the animal world, first on the ocean, then in the land. That all matches with science. And then came humans. And the Kabbalah goes a step further. It says that between every one of those levels, there was something intermediate that contained characteristics of the higher level and the lower level. So for example, between animals and humans, which are two different levels, there was an intermediary level that contains some of the characteristics of human and animal. And the Torah, the Kabbalah names that, the Arizal, names that to be the Kuf. And the Kuf is translated typically as monkey or ape. Now, the Arizal wrote this down. Of course, it was revealed much earlier, but he wrote this down hundreds of years before anybody in science ever imagined this situation. So what the Torah is telling us is that God used a creation process that followed a path that started with minerals, proceeded through animal life in the oceans, animal life on land, apes or monkeys, and humans. So it's saying, don't be surprised that when you study the appearance of life through science, that you will find that it appeared in this order. And that's exactly what we found. But that wasn't an evolution. That was creation. That was design. That's how it was made by God. And in particular, that the apes were an intermediate, and we should not be surprised to find the genetic similarities we find with apes and even the physical similarities we find with apes. But clearly, we're completely different. So there's no disagreement on what we will observe, but there's obviously a massive disagreement between the Torah and science on how things came about. As we explained earlier, it still will look natural to us, but each of these kinds and humans were created separately. So I hope that explains the whole ape business, and you can see the source in the Malbim and the Arizal is quite amazing. It predates Darwin and Lamarck. We were the first to talk about that in science by 300 years. I'm not sure if they were reading our sources or not, but it was there that they should find those similarities. Okay, are we good to keep going to the next topic, or just checking the chat line here for any? Usually I get questions on this topic for sure. Okay, what I'm going to do next is another a little lighter but a very interesting question that's asked a lot. Some people are kind of afraid to ask it, but when you talk with younger adults, they're not afraid. And the question is, how can people in Genesis have lived for hundreds of years? You may recall that in Genesis, there's some very long lifetimes. For example, Adam lived 930 years. Seth, his third son, after Cain and Abel, his third son, when we returned back to Eve, Seth lived 912 years. Even Noah lived 950 years. He was the 10th generation, and he lived 950 years. So we also know that these are real years. There's some explanations to say, well, they're not real years. They were just very smart people, so they were said to have lived that long. No, they're real years because they come right into our calendar and make the year that we have today, which is part of our halacha, that is the year 5780. And we figure out that year partly by counting these people's lifetimes and the generations. That's how we arrive at our current time. So that's how long people are said to live. And then something happened. Just before God is about to bring the flood because he's dissatisfied with what's going on, I'll read you the exact quote from the Torah. And the Lord said, "My spirit shall not contend evermore concerning man, since he is but flesh. His days shall be 120 years. And the commentaries explain is that at that point, God decided, we'll see why in a minute, but God decided to shorten the lifetime over time, not instantly, over time, to 120 years. In fact, by the time we get to Jacob lives 147 years compared to 950 for Noah. And of course, today it's tough to get to 100. So, what's going on here and what's happening, and what is the concept of lifetime in Judaism? Of course, in our secular society and in science, we have this concept that our lifetime depends on advances in medicine and in the health system, and that is true. We as we've improved the health system and medicines, we have increased the lifetime by about 10 years on average. We're living longer, but we're still well within 120 of the Torah. In the Torah, the concept is a little bit different. In the Torah, Adam was perfect. It was actually God's actual handiwork, and he was intended to live forever. So when he sinned, God decreed that he would live for one God day, which is 1,000 of our years according to Psalms. So Adam was told to live for 1,000 years. The fact that he didn't live 1,000 years is a separate story. We lived 930. And it's explained to us that when Adam sinned, he had the whole inclusive soul for all of humanity. And when he sinned, that soul had to be repaired. And what God did is he took a little bit of each of Adam's soul and gave it to each other person, like Noah and Enoch and so on, so that they could rectify that part. Because Adam's job was to rectify the world, to complete the world. He was a partner in creation. And that soul was to be rectified. And it didn't work out because the job that these people were given, people like Enoch and Noah, was a very big job. It required 1,000 years to get the job done. So the concept in the Torah of lifetime is that we're here to achieve a purpose. That purpose is embodied in our soul, and we're given the amount of time required to achieve that purpose. So those people were given a job that took almost 1,000 years, and they were given 1,000 years of lifetime. And then God decided, well, that's way too big a job. Things are getting messed up. We're going to shorten the job. We're going to make the soul smaller pieces of atom. We're going to have more people, and they're going to get a job that's smaller. And let me read you the exact source, because it's quite fascinating. This is from the Or HaHaim. Originally, God assigned great tasks to the generations prior to the flood, and at the same time equipped them with commensurate greater souls. He granted each human a certain number of days, approximately 300,000, which is over 800 years. After the failure that resulted in the flood, all of this was restricted in order to help us achieve what is expected in a lifetime of 70 or so years. So that explains what's going on. The concept in Judaism is we're here to get a job done. That job relates to us improving the world, and we do that with our free will from our soul. And God gives us the amount of time that we need to get that job done. And today, that's 120 years or less. Back then, it was 1,000 years. And that's what creates the lifetime. Obviously, if we have better medicine and health system, the body part will do better. But in the end, the limit is set by the soul. There are some scientists that believe we might get to more than 120 years on average, but there's no proof of that. So that's the Torah explanation for the long lifetimes and where they come from. I'm just checking the chat lines. Yes, there's thank you very much, Jose and Eddie and so on, for your comments on the chat line. There is discussions that, of course, our environment and our foods and so on affect the lifetime, and those people did not eat certain foods and lived in better environments and so on. But the fundamental difference from 100 to 1,000 is said to be with the task and job we've been given. We've seen in the last 100 years ourselves that by improving conditions, we can live longer physically. But the main determinant of lifetime is us getting our job done. Okay, not seeing any more comments on that. I am going to move on to the next question, which is similar to a question we covered last week, but coming at it from a different angle. And the question is, if there was only Adam and Eve, how can there be so many different races such as Chinese and African Americans today? Now, this is not just a question for Torah, it's also a question for science, because although science doesn't hold that we came from Adam and Eve, science does hold that humans first appeared in Africa and in small numbers. So we still start from one place in the world, presumably all looking more or less the same, and we end up all over the world looking somewhat different. Still, of course, human, but looking somewhat different. So let me first tell you what we've learned scientifically and then compare it to what the Torah says. You'll see that we could have shortcut a lot of time by just checking the Torah first, but that's not what happened. So what we can observe is that people have been living in a particular place, isolated, before the era of air travel. And well, now we're back to being isolated in COVID, but before the era of significant travel, there were groups of people living in particular places. They moved there, they migrated there. The Torah tells us that, science tells us that. And we observe that those people in those places have a unique set of characteristics, visible characteristics like skin color, hair, size, and also invisible characteristics like blood groups. That's just a straightforward observation. We have our own situation in America with Native Americans that were quite different before the Europeans came in and started some interbreeding. And it's understood that this diversity is a result of a set of parents which are quite similar, moving from one location to several different locations, and then interbreeding going on in those different locations, and the environment in those different locations being different, and therefore through time developing into different characteristics, the environment favoring bigger feet or darker skin, and what have you, and developing different characteristics. And that's the scientific explanation for why we started. We don't know yet from a science perspective, but how we got to all these different places and became different looking. Now, the Torah's perspective turns out to be exactly the same, but it was written down way before this was done in science. The science is quite new because it couldn't be traced until we could do genetic analysis and trace everybody's genes and figure out how everybody's related. That's in the last 30 years. In the Torah, of course, we're told we're all descendants of Adam and Eve, and then we're all descendants again from the flood, from Noah's 3 sons and their wives. After the flood, we're told where the 70 nations went, and you can map it out. I have in one of my books, and the different languages and so on, and we spread throughout the whole world. We were commanded, Adam was commanded, and so was Noah commanded to spread throughout the whole world and populate the world. And that's what we did. And then the Torah clearly explains that as we did that, we changed a little bit. The Rebbe talks about it, but it's right in the Talmud. Let me read you the quote. This is a conversation with Hillel. The man asked, "Why do Africans have wide feet?" Hillel said to him, "You've asked a significant question. The reason is because they live in marshlands and their feet widen to enable them to walk through the swampy areas." So right there, Hillel is saying that as these people moved, they changed in some minor way to look different. And of course, that predates any genetic analysis that we have done. So again, we don't have an agreement on the timeline or the exact process, but we have an agreement between the Torah and science that we descended from a few populations, and we went all over the world and changed. And that is the answer, how we ended up with all these different races from a small or a small number of people at the beginning. So that's the question. I am seeing some stuff on the chat line. Please bear with me. I'm not good at multitasking, a man, but I'll try and pick up some can be dealt with, or I'll deal with them later. Okay, one very good question. A question from Scarletta. Thank you very much. Oops, this thing moves on me. A new question comes in. Is what's going on with Adam and Hava? Was it okay for them to marry their daughters? Were they conceived in the Garden of Eden? And so on. So here's the situation. Adam and Eve, on the first day before expelled, straight from the Talmud, were able to conceive instantly. As you know, one of the punishments or consequences that are not punishments, consequences of the sin is childbirth and the 9 months and so on. But before the sin, Adam and Eve conceived instantly, and Adam and Eve had relations in the garden, and Cain and Abel were born. But what also was born is 3 girls, a twin sister to one of them and 2 twin sisters to the other. And that is derived homogenetically from the Torah, but because it has the word et. And God allowed the twin sisters to marry Cain and Abel, and that's how the population of the earth began. And our sources say that he did a hesed, a kindness, so that would work. It would not, as you know today, it would not normally work. You might get deformities. We spoke last time that it does eventually work, but in the case of the Torah, God designed it such that it would work. And that's how the population in the Torah got started, with Cain and Abel and their 3 sisters. And then, of course, outside the Garden of Eden, there were more children born, including to Adam, many more children born to Adam later on, and that became the population. The next question I see here is, how long will we live after Mushiya comes? Well, that's a complicated question, but to the best of my knowledge, this is not science and Torah, but to the best of my knowledge, the understanding is that we are each rectifying a piece of Adam's soul, and that we will bring all that together. When all the souls have been rectified, Mashiach will come. We will go through a messianic era, which will be very much like our lives today, but we will see godliness in everything instead of godliness being hidden, and the world will see God like everywhere. And eventually we will go on to the world to come. And the short answer is that our souls are eternal. They already live forever. Even when we die now, our soul is eternal. Only our soul, not animal souls, but human souls are eternal. And they will be rectified and go on after Mushiya. I don't understand the question from Jose. It's not phrased as a question, so... Yeah, we're talking about the lost tribes. I'm not going to go into the lost tribes, but yes, some of the lost tribes are some of these races. Thank you. It's a kind of a separate topic. Okay, let me go on to a really light topic, because this has been heavy topics. And a question that when I received it kind of stunned me, because I thought they got me. I don't really have an answer to this question. It's such a simple question. And the question is, how come there were cavemen if there was Adam and Eve? And where the question is coming, of course, is that we don't see in the Torah that people lived in caves. We'll see in a minute that they use caves, but we don't see in the Torah that people lived in caves. In any of the stories that we're told, that they're not living in caves. They're living in tents and things like that, but not particularly living in caves. Yet, at least from my childhood, I saw movies in which cavemen were portrayed, and they lived in caves, and they were kind of rough and wore, skins and all kinds of things. And even in some of the movies, they were even beside dinosaurs. So I've discovered that cavemen are not real. They're an invention of Hollywood. So it became a little easier to answer this question when I discovered that. I'd never done research on it. And the reason they were invented is that most of the artifacts that we had found back then from humans, including human remains, were found in caves. So people thought that maybe humans had lived in caves, but the reality is that we now believe that that's just because whatever was left in a cave was well preserved, like the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in caves. And we know for a fact people did not live in caves, because we can see their stone buildings right in front of the caves. But they stored the Dead Sea in caves. So caves might have used for storage or not just for storage, but at least things preserved well in caves. And that's what we found. And we now know through science that most people that have ever lived have not lived in caves. And it makes sense, because there's very few caves, frankly, around the world, and most of them are dark, and most of them are humid, and many of them contain wild animals, which you wouldn't want to be sharing a sleep with. So they have not lived in caves, and of course that agrees with the Torah that they have not lived in cave. However, obviously humans have used cave for all kinds of purposes, and in fact we have many instances in the Torah of people using caves. The most famous one is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who was the Zohar was transmitted through him, and he spent many years, 13 years, in a cave in the 2nd century there. And I mentioned the Dead Sea Scrolls. Of course, that's not in the Torah, but in a similar time frame, those people were using the caves to write the scrolls, to get out of the heat, in that case right by the Dead Sea during the day, and to store them, but they lived in stone houses right in front of them, which you can still see the remains of today. So no cavemen, sorry about that. And I see a few questions here. Again, it's a statement, correct statement, that about Adam and Eve being the first two to start the world. They weren't Jewish, they were humans. All humans are descendants from Adam and Eve, but it wasn't until Abraham that recognized God that we became a monotheistic path. And in the case of Jews, that path was complete with Jacob and his 12 sons. So Jacob is the first Jew, and his 12 sons are the 12 tribes of Israel. Whereas Abraham and Isaac had other kids that became other nations, like Ishmael, for example, the Arab nations. Okay, I don't see any other questions that I can answer in real time. Thank you very much for your feedback and interaction. We're supposed to go for 45 minutes. I got a few more minutes, so if you have patience, I'll do one more, a heavy topic, but I think relevant to the topics we've been discussing, and that is a topic about the human soul. The question is, does the human soul exist, and can science detect it? So you will recall that when Adam is created, God forms his body out of the ground, not in a dissimilar fashion to the way he forms the body of animals, but then he breathed, the Lord formed man out of the dust of the earth, and he blew into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. So we have, and that's a bara event, a creation out of nothing, or this piece out of a piece of God, out of nothing physical, and that soul is breathed into man. Now, what's going on scientifically? This soul, well, science has no way to measure a soul yet, or maybe ever. But what science has done is they've gone around and they've studied the behavior of all the primates, in particular Jane Goodall did a lot of work, and they've inferred the behavior of past living creatures that they believe were human-like from their remains. They might have painted, or they might have done certain things, created tools. And they've extracted a set of behaviors that science calls modern human behaviors, which scientists believe only we possess. Nothing else possesses these behaviors. And that's what makes us uniquely human, because our bodies are not unique. We have some of the same functions as other precursors. But the behaviors make it unique. And those to make it very quick, they're all listed on Wikipedia if you want to look at them, what these modern human behaviors are. They're not what anybody expected. They're not that we take better care of our kids. They're not that we fight less. Not that we fight a lot and sometimes we're not good parents. They're not those things. Believe it or not, animals are pretty good at parenting also. What they are is in three big groups. The first is we use complex language, what we're doing right now. We are having a very complex conversation. There's a monkey in Israel who has been taught 300 sign language words, and he can say, I want a banana, but he cannot talk about the human soul, or even things that monkeys talk about. He can only talk about very simple things. The next one is our ability to think abstractly and to symbolically. So we can think that a circle could be a ball, could be an apple, could be the whole earth, could be a geometric figure on a piece of paper. Other animals can't think that way. A ball is a ball, an earth is an earth, an apple is an apple. They're not all circles. They're not all one class, one symbol. And that symbolic behaviors was given us music and art and mathematics and very unique behaviors. And the final one that science has discovered is our ability to plan. We look at the past, we look at the present, and we make a plan for the future. We don't just live in the present. So that's what science has discovered. And from an evolutionary point of view, they don't have good answers for this. They don't have good answers why we're sitting around at night looking at the stars and trying to understand the world, or why we're painting caves back then and painting things today. We should, at least back then, we should have been out hunting and collecting food. Today we can go to the store and buy it, but in those days we should have been out hunting. Like today we're working, not painting. We didn't have the spare time. So it's not a good explanation for these modern human behaviors. Now here's the fascinating part. The Torah tells us that we get a divine soul, and then it goes on to describe what comes with that soul. What would you expect from a divine soul that you would not expect from an animal soul? And the Torah enumerates these things hundreds and thousands of years before they were discovered by scientists. And what the Torah says is basically what science has discovered. The Torah says that our soul came with speech. And speech in the Torah is, the best definition I've seen it, is the ability to study Talmud. Like, it's complicated speech. It's not I want a banana. It's a complicated argument, which clearly no animals have any ability to. We're made in God's image, which means that we have the creative process that God has. We understand a bit of that creative process from the Kabbalah, and it certainly includes symbolic behavior and other things. So a very good match. And finally, the sources tell us that we have the ability to envision the future. We have the ability to look at the present and the past and envision a new future and work towards it. So it's a little bit more complicated that science calls planning. There's more to it than planning. It's actually envisioning. Of course, that's what entrepreneurs do when they create new things such as the iPhone. They don't just plan, they actually envision a whole new world of cell phones, and then they plan. So that's what the Torah says comes with our soul. And all of these things are enumerated in the Torah hundreds of years, written down. Of course, they were given orally first, but they're written down hundreds of years before science has made their discovery of the modern human behaviors. So although science will not acknowledge a soul, science acknowledges that we have unique modern human behaviors, and they match one for one with what the Torah says are the behaviors that come with our soul. Think of our soul as a software app. First, God made the body, the hardware of the computer, and then he put in an app, and that app came with speech, with planning, and with symbolic behavior. Now, there's one more thing that came with our human soul, divine soul, and that's also what the in the image of God means, and that is free will. And science, of course, is debating whether free will exists or not, but the Torah is crystal clear that it's all about free will and our choice. So thank you very much. Those are all the kind of prepared questions I had from prior audiences to discuss with you. If there's any further, a little bit over time, if there's any further questions, I'll take them now on the chat line. If not, I really appreciate things. And if you have other questions, please put them on the chat line or send them to me in a message on Facebook, and I will try to answer them. I'm on a book on all these questions, so the more questions, the better. And if you enjoyed this, please like it and share it so other people can see it. And thank you very much. I'll stay on for a minute or two, see if there's something in the chat line.